Hello, my name is Poppy Gerard Abbott and I'm a PhD researcher in sociology here at the University of Edinburgh. My research is on sexual and gender-based violence in the education context, so I look at violence among student populations in UK universities, and today I'm going to be talking to you about feminist approaches to methods and research. I'm so happy that we're kicking off the first week of the semester with a feminist angle. Just before we begin, please be aware that this presentation will have references to ableist language and to violence, so please just bear in mind that content warning. So the structure of today's lecture will be as follows. Firstly, we will unpack the assumptions and stereotypes that we often attribute to the feminist movement and that surround feminism, which inhibit us from drawing on the rich and valuable lessons, learnings and insights the feminist movement have to offer us, our learning and our research. Secondly, we will look at epistemology, methodology and methods. These are key for not only this module, but as you advance through your degree programme and you come to do your own research projects when it comes to your dissertation. So it aims to prepare you for that. Thirdly, we will look at feminism beyond being a movement, so actually as a lens and a framework for our everyday lives, for our everyday learning, for research and methods. And then lastly, we will touch on all of these subjects in relation to COVID-19, and I will leave you with a link to another lecture I delivered on adapting research methods to COVID if you are interested in taking that learning further. So I'm going to start off by asking, what is your relationship to feminism? Or if you struggle to answer that, perhaps a more narrowed question would be, what were your immediate intellectual or emotional reactions when you saw this lecture in the module? Did you feel excited, curious, dread, anger, rejection? So whatever your reactions and answers were to the questions that I just posed, there's one thing for sure, you will have reactions and answers. Everybody has an opinion on feminism. Feminism and feminist perspectives have become much more reachable for many of us as a result of modernisation and technologisation, where across most socioeconomic classes, people have access to 24/7 news, to politics, to social media, and this is compounded with increases of women in politics and education, pushing feminist policy and political agendas, and also influential figures like celebrities publicly subscribing to feminism in its liberal and mainstream forms. Capitalism has also got its hands on feminism, which has propelled it into the mainstream and reconceptualized the movement as a brand. And there is intense debate as to whether this is a good thing. So some argue that marketization has diluted and homogenized the radical messaging of feminism and runs in tension with the movement's long-standing critiques of capitalism. And some think, on the other hand, that by whatever means necessary, getting feminist messaging into the public domain and into education is a good thing. But as feminism has become mainstreamed and thus increased its visibility and sphere of reach and influence, so has the anti-feminist movement. So there's been large degrees of backlash against feminism. So branches of the anti-feminist movement have been associated with the so-called alt-right and with men's movements, such as the so-called men's rights activists or MRA movement. But anti-feminism can be found across the whole political spectrum. It isn't just gate-kept within, for example, the alt-right. So looking at examples of the anti-feminist movement, here is conservative political commentator Milo Yiannopoulos giving one of his many talks to universities and news or media platforms. So his journalistic career has largely revolved around opposition to social justice movements and to the so-called Islamification of the West. He's also gained a lot of coverage for his acerbic style and popularised the term you see here on the slide, where he likens the feminist movement to cancer. And this was geared towards illustrating what he thinks are the degenerative and coup-esque characteristics to the movement, i.e. feminism being responsible for societal breakdown and the death of certain values in society, and also sort of holding society to ransom with its demands, much like the spread of cancerous cells around the body and the hold that cancer can have on the body. So anti-feminism has really taken off as a result of the expansion of internet-based and digital platforms. It's a very recurring and common theme in vlogging and blogging. So on this slide, you'll find transgender commentator Blair White, who runs a very successful YouTube channel, and she employs a similar rhetoric to the many commentators like Milo Yiannopoulos, who have dedicated their careers to this anti-feminist messaging. And she sort of employs the language of medical degradation here, of viruses and virology. And this anti-feminist rhetoric often, as with Yiannopoulos, spills over into ableist vocabulary, so comparing feminist values and beliefs to mental illness and disability. As you can see from the quote on this slide, a discourse analysis of anti-feminism shows us that synonyms of stupidity, which obviously have historical connotations to disability, is a very core feature to anti-feminist narratives. But it's not just those with 5 million followers who are hooking onto and supporting anti-feminism. On this slide, you'll see references to a viral feminist campaign called Who Needs Feminism? So this took off in 2012, so before the Me Too movement. Members of the public posted selfies with signs about why they deem feminism important. This was met by a sea of women and some men posting counter signs. Again, here we see the vocabulary of ableism in relation to psychiatric disorders. So a specific common feature of the anti-feminist movement is the conflation of feminist values and beliefs with psychosis or schizophrenia. Interestingly, we are seeing some of the most oppressed groups subscribing to anti-feminism, including the working classes and religious and ethnic minority commentators. So here on the slide is Candace Owens, a political commentator in the US, who is famous for her anti-Black Lives Matter stance, which has very similar messaging to her anti-feminist, that these movements are self-destructive and that they chain you to a state of victimhood consciousness, and that they are societally destructive, disrupting orders and structures of law, order, heteronormativity and public-private divides. And here she is outlining why feminists may be considered as unmarriable. She is, again, similar to the other slides I've shown you, disputing their intellectual capacity and therefore their right to survive and reproduce. And in politics, we see anti-feminism on a much more institutional and entrenched basis. So here is a quote that illustrates how, again, feminism is seen as an effort or campaign of societal destruction. But what I really think is powerful about this quote is that it shows us the extent and depth of hatred and responsibility pinned onto the movement. There is this bar of hyper expectation for the things feminism needs to apparently answer for as a result of feminism being attributed to various socioeconomic patterns and issues, such as high divorce rates, the attainment gap between boys and girls, male suicide, poor mental health among men, and male unemployment, among other things. What is really interesting about anti-feminism from historical, sociological, anthropological and political angles is that it's nothing new. Yes, it manifests in different forms in 2021 as largely digitally mediated, but feminists are well rehearsed and accustomed to the stereotypes and abuse I've touched on. So here are some images from the Suffragette movement in the early 1900s, where anti-feminist propaganda and literature were prevalent. So on the left, you'll see a poster depicting women who want the vote to be coercive, to be abusers, to be almost an emasculating force to men. And to the right, you'll find a very striking cartoon adopting the features of, I think, a cave woman. And think about, what is that imagery intended to conjure into our minds? Connotations of backwardness, uncleanliness, violence, savageness, stupidity, instinct rather than logic-based thinking, less human, Neanderthal-like. So these sorts of postcards, posters and hate mail, as I said, were prevalent during the suffragette movement. And here we can draw fascinating parallels with this trend of anti-feminism and today's omnipresence of anti-feminist imagery, campaigns, even official groups that organise around anti-feminism. As there were during the suffragette movement, there were official campaign groups of men and women who were opposed to women's suffrage. If we think critically and through a sociological lens at anti-feminism, there are some key cultural and historical themes and patterns. So much of the vitriol geared towards feminists relates to them being unwanted by men and being unattractive, which is designed to inflict hurt and harm on the basis that a woman's value equates to her appearance, the degree in which she is desired by men, and her ability to conform to heteronormative expectations and milestones. This links to the most common insult towards feminists being that they are lesbians, and the fact that this is instrumentalized as an insult is rooted in historical homophobic beliefs that LGBT people are mentally sick or disabled. Referring to the image on the slide, I think there are really interesting links between depictions of feminists and that of Eve in the Bible as being stupid and therefore being gullible to consuming poison, i.e. feminist ideas. And then, as a result of her stupidity, Eve caused original sin, or the fall of man, which dooms humanity to eternal pain and suffering forever. So this relates to anti-feminist beliefs that feminism is a force of socio-cultural toxicity, causing an inversion or an imbalance of natural orders, where feminists are trying to orchestrate a world where they have a penis and embody the masculine and therefore possess power and be leaders. And this obviously goes against historical state agendas for women to be the child bearers of the next generation. And this is where the rhetoric that feminists want to be like men, in inverted commas, comes from, that they are wrongly fighting their natural state of being, that they are jealous of men, they want to overcome and outcompete men, they want to wrestle their power from them and overcome and wipe out institutions of male power, such as politics, men in leadership in general, finance. So you may have heard the mantra that feminism and gender equality has gone too far. So this is where we see anti-feminism really overinflating the amount of power feminism actually possesses, and perhaps the right that privileged groups feel they have over power. I think this really comes under the microscope when we think critically about this rhetoric. They're sort of unwilling to share power, and any tremor to their power is met with intense backlash, a real sense of ownership and entitlement to power, and a strong dedication to not sharing it with marginalized groups. Then there's also this rhetoric around obsessiveness, that feminists are mono-focused on power and control and all consumed by issues of gender equality. This relates again to an underlying belief used to legitimize the underrepresentation of women in positions of power, that women are naturally poor leaders, poorer decision makers, that they are less rational and possess less critical thinking faculties, so they can be more easily influenced. If we think about this symbolism behind Eve being tempted by the serpent and eating the apple that causes the fall of man, she is pictured as untrustworthy and incapable of making rational decisions. And the story of Eve and the serpent, how she was deceptive to Adam and to God, also shows us the sexist and essentialist myths that underpin rape culture, that women, their sort of character and essence, are inherently deceitful. This very much relates to generally misogynistic beliefs, but ones that we see come under the microscope within anti-feminist movements. So this means that feminists are trapped in an eternal victim consciousness, sort of inventing things to be upset about, but at the same time creating their conditions of oppression, as Eve did when she doomed humankind to eternal sin and suffering. This also suggests that women are, again, predisposed to lying about their condition, so their word and their voice are seen as less legitimate, valid, just, reasonable, and this very much relates to, as I've already said, ongoing, widely held beliefs and rape and sexual violence myths, that women commonly lie about rape, and that feminists exaggerate about inequalities and the conditions of women and women's labour. And then this is all compounded with the ableist rhetoric I've mentioned on previous slides about anti-suffrage, from anti-suffrage and anti-feminist commentators. So the attitude that women who talk about feminism because they are stupid or mentally and intellectually disabled. So they need the presence of rational masculinity to lead them on decision making and tell them what their conditions are because they are unable to make sound judgments about it themselves. So it's interesting to those who know feminism, that actually have lived experience of the movement, that these representations are far from the realities of living and applying feminism. We often speak about feminists as if they're actually a single unit of people, a homogenized group, but it has no headquarters and no governing. It is instead a very broad and rich tapestry, so broad that there is as much infighting as there is between feminists and anti-feminists. And it is so diverse that if you were to speak to two feminists on different parts of the political spectrum, you may struggle to think that they are actually within the same ideological sphere. So there are liberal, radical, Marxist, libertarian, socialist, anarchist, green, and other, just to name a few, arms of the feminist movement. And there are even growing conservative and neoliberal groups of thought within the feminist movement. There are also religious, such as Mormon or Jewish feminisms, and intersectional forms, such as trans-inclusive feminism, and feminisms originating from the global south and practicing from post-colonial analytical perspectives, such as Indian feminisms and Black feminisms. So I think that feminism is a history. It encompasses a history and seeks to shed light on what women and other marginalised groups have done and experienced throughout time. It's also a testimony-based movement, acting as a platform for stories of violence, oppression, war, conflict, colonialism and slavery. This is why feminism has many standpoints to it, because women come to it from so many different experiences, and thus it is often a storytelling channel for the personal and a source of solidarity and communal collective memory, knowledge and experience, which is why it is often referred to as a sisterhood. Feminists rally around political issues such as the right to vote, access to contraception, fair representation in Parliament, but it is often reduced to these aspects and confined to the language of equality and human rights. But for many, feminism is more than this. It is a self-actualizing and consciousness-raising mechanism for individuals and communities to understand the world as socially constructed, that this world, seeing the world not as naturally structured in the way it ought to be, but actually there are deliberate, seeing it as having deliberate social structures that advantage some and disadvantage others. It is also a tool to evaluate social life and personal life, including your relationships, your history, the politics of emotions, family, work and labour. And fundamentally, it sees the personal as political, so the body as a canvas of culture and society. And I hope this lecture can support you in being introspective and heuristic about knowledge. So, for example, ask yourself, what is my relationship with feminism? Where did I get my ideas about feminism from? What stereotypes and assumptions do I bring to my education, to the learning space? So feminism is often equated to women because it has the word femme in it, but for many, including myself, it is actually very little to do with just men and women. It is instead a framework to evaluate power, and importantly, power in all its forms, not just gender. The reason it's called feminism is because structures of power and therefore social stratification and inequalities are constructed within the context of patriarchy, which is probably the oldest and most far-reaching social organising structure. And all of these different power structures, the inequalities created by patriarchy and the violence used to sustain inequalities, all of these are rooted in patriarchy, with patriarchy being its source or genesis, if you like. So feminism, in opposing and critiquing patriarchy, seeks to liberate the things that patriarchy subordinates, and those things relate somehow to the feminine. So on a more philosophical level, patriarchy is a system that creates a pecking order of symbolic meaning that shapes social stratification. So it values masculinity and places this at the top. And this doesn't just refer to men. The male gender is one embodiment of masculinity. Here I'm referring to symbols, forms, acts, behaviors, and things that are associated with masculinity and are seen as possessing and performing the masculine essence. So, for example, certain forms of physical strength, acts of violence, and traits that emphasize power, such as assertiveness, dominance, and machismo. These are given superiority in all areas of society. And then the binary opposite is femininity, which is again a set of symbols, forms, behaviors, things that are seen as embodying the feminine essence. These things are relegated as inferior. So this symbolic philosophy is the logic of patriarchy, and feminism therefore is based on the critique of this order, the reconceptualization and rebalancing of the feminine, and therefore the disruption of, by default, of all power systems. So by leading on the point of reconceptualizing femininity, feminism aims to disrupt all power systems. And then the last point on this slide leads us into methods. So feminism is, as well as a political movement, a heuristic mechanism and a philosophy, it is also a disciplinary lens to bring in perspectives and knowledges that are traditionally subordinated in that discipline. So you'll come across feminist psychology, history, literature studies, archaeology, and so on. And feminist disciplinary angles aim to come to see and be critical of the factors that cause certain forms of knowledge to be valued and others to be discarded and invisibilized, and B, to recenter, rebalance and equalize subordinated knowledges and agents of those knowledges. This brings me on to the topic of epistemology, of which there are feminist versions of. So epistemology refers to and is defined as knowledge creation processes. And here I want to illustrate to you what the relationship is between epistemology and the methods you will study on this module, and then go on to use as you move towards your dissertation project. So when we make choices about what research methods we choose and use, we look at the methodology behind those methods. So a method is the strategy to answer your research question and to embark on the research process with. Methodology is the study of methods, hence ology. This means study of. It is a rationale for why you choose certain methods. It is the philosophy, the logic, the paradigm to which methods belong. So, for example, interviews generally belong to qualitative methodologies and surveys to quantitative. And those methodologies have certain qualities to them. For example, qualitative methodologies allow you to gain rich, in-depth data, and quantitative methodologies allow you to get data of scale. And as you can see from these two images on the slide, behind methodology is epistemology, which explores what we define to be knowledge and valid knowledge, which our methodology and methods then seek to harvest and capture through research. In our research processes, epistemology can be translated into a set of helpful questions. So which forms of knowledge do we validate and deem as legitimate claims to truth? So for example, just to ground it for you, how do we see certain people as experts? How do we value the voices and knowledge of certain people over others, such as in the classroom or in a meeting with colleagues? And subsequently, which owners and speakers of knowledge are deemed to be worthy of being in that space and being seen as deserving to be part of knowledge creation processes, such as policy, research, and law formation? At the bottom, you'll find a theory from Indian feminist Gayatri Spivak, who says that exclusion from knowledge creation processes can be conceptualized as a form of violence because it invisibilizes the voices, truths, and experiences of certain groups, especially testimonies of oppression, removing authority from them and keeping authority ring-fenced to certain groups over others. This exclusion then reinforces the subordinate status of certain oppressed groups by producing, for example, systems, policies and laws that do not reflect their needs, and creates societal attitudes and psychologies of inferiority, voicelessness and hatred, both external and internal to the people in those groups. So to practice epistemological reflection and thinking in your learning about methods and research, take a read of the questions on this slide and refer back to them throughout the module. Feminist epistemology can offer us, I believe, a very helpful lens for approaching and executing research. There are several reasons for this, which I'll now list. So to start off with, summarising and consolidating the previous slide, it gets us thinking about what levels of so-called epistemological or testimonial authority or weight do we attribute to certain people, certain social characteristics and certain voices. So for example, evidence shows that if a male lecturer and a female lecturer delivered the exact same lecture, the male lecturer will always be graded higher, given more positive feedback and appraisals, because maleness is attributed with higher levels of epistemological or testimonial authority. Feminist epistemology also encourages us to engage in constant self-reflection and reflexivity as a researcher. So getting you thinking about the origins of knowledge. For example, why do I think that certain methods or theorists are more prestigious than others? Why do I see those people, that group, or myself as an expert? One very important question in regards to the topics we choose in research is, why am I well positioned to conduct research on this topic? What is my relationship to or responsibility towards this topic? What knowledges can I bring to this topic? And why am I the right person to represent the knowledge of this group of people? Or are there people better positioned to access and represent and understand the knowledges associated with this topic? Next, there is the issue of positionality. So positionality refers to how your social characteristics, such as age, race, gender, and class, shapes your access to data and fieldwork sites, and shapes the lens in which you interpret data. So our positionality can affect, for example, the rapport we have with participants and our privileges or barriers in accessing fieldwork spaces. For example, I have experienced privilege as a result of being a white researcher and being associated with a prestigious academy like the University of Edinburgh, but I've experienced barriers for being a woman. So therefore, feminist approaches to methods seek to, I think, visibilize the invisible questions. It seeks to examine how research and knowledge creation are fundamentally gendered and racialized processes, whereas often if research is practiced from a non-feminist, in inverted commas, standpoint, it is approached in so-called gender or colorblind ways. And subsequently, it gets us thinking about power. What power do we have to represent our participants, to portray data in certain ways, and to have power over our participants' stories? There are very pressing questions around the power that we possess when people share their stories with us. So how can we render certain groups as less heard and therefore reinforce structures of powerlessness and powerful through our choice of methods and through our research? And next, so if we see knowledge as communally constructed and created between people, see knowledge as a plural and as a co-construction rather than an extraction process where we parachute in as researchers, we harvest knowledge and data, and then we leave the fieldwork site to go off and in isolation write up our findings. So many feminist researchers have actually seen this as a masculine and colonial relationship with research and with our participants. It neglects our duties of care and fails to be conscientious about the needs of the communities that we study. If they are vulnerable groups, for example, the need for stability, continuity and trust are incredibly important, and this parachute in, parachute out, traditional conventional approach to data collection is detrimental to those needs. So last couple of points. If we see the events surrounding our data collection as data in itself, such as emotional expression and the social and political events surrounding the research process, we can be more creative in our methods and employ observation-based and diary-based methods to document our participants' emotions and as well as our own, and connect our research topic to socio-political events in a live way. And finally, it gets us thinking, feminist epistemology gets us thinking about political responsibility and impact. So thinking about the choices that we make around research topics and methods. So how research is an opportunity to improve the lives of our participants by raising awareness of marginalised stories and providing our participants with an infrastructure of care. So on this slide, you'll find a series of questions that translate feminism as a framework. So in a nutshell, I see feminist epistemology and feminist approach to research as a philosophy of making invisible people and invisible knowledge visible, seeing who and what isn't being said and what isn't there as just as, if not more important than what is there in your research process. So as with the flowchart I showed you before, methods and methodology follows on from the more abstract and philosophical realm of epistemology. So when you go about choosing the right method to answer a problem, it can be a very overwhelming and daunting task, because almost like standing in a supermarket, we are choosing between hundreds of different options and combinations, searching through piles of literature, and there is all of this noise around us. It can be hard to cut through that and make decisions. What's even harder about it is that it's not politics free. So as feminist epistemology tells us, what is awarded academic prestige is dependent on the epistemological authority we give certain methods and research topics. And this leads us to make many assumptions about what makes a good research project. For example, that it needs to be as large as possible, that it needs to employ certain methods that are seen to be the most scientific in inverted commas, and that certain groups need to be recruited because they are the ones that possess the knowledge and expertise to get the data that we want. Feminist researchers have regarded these assumptions to be a symptom of the mainstreaming and institutionalization of masculinity and colonial dynamics within academia, higher education and research, that a strong research project is conquering, triumphalist and almost macho with a bigger is better attitude and upholding conventional ideas about who is an expert and who is not. These common assumptions we hold before we even commence the research process can inhibit us from realizing the full spectrum of creative methodological choices available to us and opportunities for gaining data and knowledge in places we would least expect it. As I've already said, from groups we wouldn't assume to invite to the research, or from observations and emotional expressions and events surrounding the data collection process. It's important to know that there is no single one way of conducting feminist research, which is where the beauty lies in it. But I would say there are core principles. These are A, being critical at every stage of the research timeline. So the design process through to the execution of methods, i.e. the data collection, through to subsequent data analysis. So really centering the question, how can we see knowledge as socially situated? And then B, being critical about how and why we award authority and power to some people and their voices and some ways of doing things over others, and how this has shaped certain methods being seen as the right way to do things and as the most scientific and academic, and subsequently shutting out a spectrum of creative methods and mixed methods paradigms. So interestingly, much like the patriarchal binary of masculine and feminine, that dichotomy, research methods are also gendered and therefore placed on a hierarchy of power and prestige. And this is where we come to see the logic or the point of binaries. So this is to divide up groups so that one is superior and the other is positioned as inferior. So hopefully this slide will offer you a visualization of this methodological binary that I've just mentioned. So here you will see the traditional gendered associations of the qualitative-quantitative binary. And this has led, as I wrote on the last slide, to many feminist researchers outright rejecting quantitative methods to express a rejection of this binary and of its value system, and to deconstruct and reconstruct the academic meanings and values of qualitative research. So I'm now going to zone in on the readings that I set you for this lecture, starting off with Nicole Westmoreland. So she argues that research and subsequently methods have long been dominated by certain groups and have excluded data from marginalised groups and on marginalised topics, such as issues of oppression, violence and inequality, from the perspective of those who have suffered these things. She also argues that research is often seen as a so-called objective process, and she argues that objectivity is seen as emotionless study and as a research process that is sanitized of subjectivity. So good research being research that is devoid of emotion and subjectivities, because emotions are associated with the feminine. So she disputes the concept of objectivity, which, as you'll come to learn, is often surrounded with a mantra. It is one of many assumptions we hold about research, that we must strive for objectivity. But what is interesting about this is, what do we actually mean by this? What do we mean by objectivity? So feminist approaches to research tell us that subjectivity and emotional expression are actually core to research processes and are conducive rather than hindering to research, because through including emotions and environmental factors, we gain intense knowledge into and insights into social processes, into inequalities, social structures and processes and issues. Furthermore, there is no such thing as objective or unbiased knowledge, because both the researcher and the participants have, and they possess situated knowledges as a result of their experiences, their socioeconomic conditions, and their positionality. And this all fundamentally shapes the data we access, collect, and analyse. The same could be said for the environment in which the research is being conducted. We in our research are fundamentally intertwined with our environment. Subjectivity, emotions, environment are all points of interesting discussion. They are fundamentally part of our inquiry and are opportunities for rich sociological insight and data collection, rather than something to be discarded or overcame. And what I find amusing about the objectivity mantra and obsession is that it seeks to comb out any subjectivity, emotions, and environmental factors on the basis that these hinder data. But if you take out these things, then you end up with just the echoes of the researcher's beliefs. And this is seen as being the richest data, the most objective way of doing research. But we exclude so much if we do research in this way. Westmoreland also argues that feminist researchers shouldn't necessarily align themselves with qualitative methods and should instead seek to disrupt and undermine the methodological binary by exploring mixed methods, creative methods, and designing questions that validate marginalized forms of knowledge. So she argues that all methods can be instrumentalized to present sexist or racist data and reinforce stereotypical or sexist or racist theories. So, for example, I once saw a lecturer present a graph on the amount of hours women work in the workplace in comparison to men. And he drew the conclusion that this meant women are less productive in the workplace because they're more likely to be in part-time work, more likely to take leave for childbearing and child rearing and care work. But as feminists have told us, women work the double shift of paid and unpaid labour, with domestic, community and reproductive labour being on top of their paid work, this amounting to trillions of unpaid invisible labour. In fact, it's not even considered work. But if we baseline work or workplace participation on a male-centric experience of work and only focus on, for example, the physical hours you will spend at your desk, then this will produce a sexist view of the data. Another example is the racist history within medical practice and within anthropology, where research has been practiced deliberately to try and evidence, for example, the genetic, cultural and intellectual inferiority of Black people and create racist pseudoscientific theories to categorize humans on a spectrum of evolution and development. If you haven't, by the way, read the Westmoreland reading I set for this lecture, I really do recommend you do, because she, in this article, writes a really comprehensive literature review of the key scholars in feminist methods, so you can delve further into the aspects that interest you. She also writes really accessibly, which feminist researchers and academics often regard to be a core value to feminist approaches, by avoiding the control of power through gatekeeping of knowledge and education. So the second reading that I set is by Patricia Hill Collins. So she is a Black feminist who authored the Matrix of Domination theory. This theory teaches us that inequalities are intersecting. So for example, race, class, age, gender and disability all interact and accumulate to formulate our socioeconomic standing. So in this reading, she shows us how colonialism and sexism are actually closely aligned and are entrenched within research and knowledge creation processes. She argues that the exclusion of women, in particular Black women, from power and knowledge creation processes is an acute representation of the interrelationship between sexism and racism, and how colonialism and slavery have created long-lasting legacies that actively remove voice from Black women. There is a key point within feminist research that due to the history of subjugation and lived experience of oppression, marginalised groups actually possess unique, distinct and acute insight into the social world, and therefore are well or even best positioned to give us sociological knowledge in our research processes. So bringing things up to the present day, to the now, in regards to the COVID-19 pandemic, I think we can come to see the utility of feminist epistemologies and methodologies during this time. So if we apply the feminist lens or framework, not only can we come to see how crisis intersects with power and is gendered, and likewise the same could be said for policy formation, we can also form critical approaches towards the running of higher education and research during the pandemic. And this is where we can come to see how there has been a hypermasculine and colonial rhetoric promoted. So this language of squashing, overcoming, being triumphant over the virus, and a rhetoric of getting back to capitalism as quickly as possible, getting back to work, to productivity and consumption, treating COVID-19 as something over there to be boxed and overcame. COVID-19 has been articulated within the research arena and within higher education as a disruption, as an inconvenience, or even as a doomsday to our research. But I want us to instead reconfigure the relationship we have with this crisis as a mirror to ourselves, to our research participants, and to our research problems, and to the social world. COVID cannot be destroyed with a fist. It needs to be understood in order to be responded to. So if we perhaps COVIDify a feminist approach to research, we can value approaches and methods that relate to observation and emotion. So epidemiologists and virologists have had to get close to COVID in order to understand it. They've had to get close to it to study it in order to develop a vaccine to exit us out of this crisis. And social scientists are the same. We need to get close to it in order to understand the world we are in right now and to develop strategies that will improve people's lives. So I've always argued that we should see COVID-19 as a microscope to the social world, as not a creator of inequalities, but as an exacerbator of age-old inequalities, and as a magnifying glass to witness those inequalities. COVID-19 is a set of environmental factors in which our research is operating within. You wouldn't study a community of people without studying their environmental factors that shape their rituals, their behaviours, their language, and COVID is the exact same. So as you study this module, think about the ways you can choose and practice methods and study research topics within the context of COVID rather than separate to it. And I also have an additional lecture that goes into these themes with greater depth if you are interested in adapting methods to COVID-19. So I'll link that in underneath this lecture. And finally, thank you so much for listening to this presentation today. I hope you shut your laptop and walk away with curiosity, questions, a hunger for learning more about methods, and an enthusiasm for your future research projects. I appreciate that many of the themes and concepts today have been quite advanced and challenging, so please don't hesitate to reach out should you have any questions. Best of luck with all of your future research endeavours.